afternoon. Thank you for having me this afternoon. I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite parts of my job, which is city budgeting. Being new to the organization, I'm still learning some of the challenges in my first year, but here's what I know. So the City of North Bend Finance Department, we're comprised of 3 employees, myself, the finance director, and 2 accounting technicians. Between the 3 of us, these are the list of services that our department offers internally and externally. As I said, though, today we're just going to focus on budget. So we'll talk a little bit about budget process. We'll discuss some differences in funds and resource types, and then also discuss some of the challenges that we see as we develop the budget. So first of all, city budgeting is a full year cycle. So we typically start development sometime around the first of the calendar year, and that entails department heads, the finance director, and the city administrator to get together and provide our best estimates and forecasts on revenues and expenditures for the upcoming fiscal year. That becomes the proposed budget document, which we take to the budget committee first. They approve the document. Also, we are looking for budget committee members as well. They would approve the budget document, make a recommendation to City Council, and City Council ultimately has to adopt that budget by June 30th of every year. Those are both public processes in which we take public testimony. The third part of the cycle would be the implementation, where staff implements the budget through spending. And then the fourth portion of the cycle is ongoing, so this happens year long. I monitor the budget regularly. I make quarterly reports to the City Council on budget status. And in addition, we have at least twice a year where we can make adjustments. That would be for unanticipated grants that might come in. We didn't know about them at the time that we put the budget together. We can recognize them throughout the year, or on other unforeseen circumstances that may arise. Today, however, we'll just focus on that budget development process. So when preparing the budget, it's important to understand the structure, the different pieces of the budget. And we'll start first with funds. And I like to think of funds as buckets. So a fund is a bucket of money set aside for a specific purpose. In North Bend, we divide those buckets into general fund type and non-general fund type. So your general fund would also include your public safety fund. So that's your police and fire. And these are mostly made up of discretionary resources. Discretionary means it comes to us without very many restrictions or any at all. Whereas in our non-general funds, those are things like the special revenue funds, enterprise funds, capital funds, reserve funds, and our debt service funds. Those particular resources we call dedicated, because when they come to us, they have specific requirements on how we can spend them. So now that we have our funds, we have to decide what services to allocate those to. So we have services and departments. Those are kind of interchangeable terms. The City of North Bend has the following services listed here, from administration to our public safety, which is police and fire, all the way on down to wastewater. Here's a quick example of how this comes together. So we're putting together our fiscal year 22 budget, and we have 4 different buckets. The first being general fund, library fund, a municipal pool fund, and our equipment construction fund. So general fund, those are discretionary monies. They can support services like our finance, admin, parks, and public works. Library, on the other hand, those are dedicated sources. So those are specific to just library service. Same with the municipal pool fund. When we get into the equipment construction fund, this is a capital fund. So what we spend it on depends on the resource that's coming into it. Oftentimes that's grants, or it could be transfers in from the general fund. Depending on the intent of the resource coming in, determines what service we fund with it. And in this particular case, it's police, fire, and parks. Okay, so now that we understand the different parts of our budget, we have the buckets of money and the services supported by the money, how does the city decide what gets funded and from which sources? We take a number of things into consideration. First, as I talk about, we estimate the best we can resources to come in the upcoming fiscal year. In doing that, we also look at the money coming in and decide, is it dedicated money or is it discretionary money? And then we further define that money as, is it one time or is it ongoing? Then we also have to forecast, estimate what the upcoming cost of those services at our current service levels will be for the next year. Once we have those two things, we can start applying our resources, our dedicated resources, to the various services that they're intended for. Once we've identified all of our dedicated sources, if there's any kind of shortfall in a particular fund, then we might start using discretionary resources to fill in the gaps. So an example here would be in our gas tax fund. It's made up of mostly dedicated resources. However, if there was a year where it was unable to be balanced, potentially we could take general fund money, transfer that in to balance the budget. If we get to the end of that process and we still can't balance all funds, then we have to start taking into consideration different things like council goals and their priorities. So that might mean that if we don't have enough money, we potentially have to look at cutting something. If we have excess money, maybe we look at increasing services somewhere. So first, let's take a look at some general fund resources and the challenges associated with those. As we discussed, general fund also includes our public safety funds, so police and fire. And some of the discretionary resources we see within the general fund are first and foremost the property taxes. We also see things like franchise fees, state share revenues. In addition, we have a few dedicated resources in our general fund, one being public safety fee. And so here you can kind of see how that gets applied. So in your police and fire departments, that blue is the public safety fee, that's dedicated money, and it's only spent on police and fire services. And then you have the green, which is your property tax. That's the largest resource in your general fund. That gets distributed to all of those services. And then the rest of the services paid for with other resources. So that's things like your state revenue sharing, interest earnings, and so on. And this data is specific to fiscal year 21 actuals. So oftentimes, knowing that property taxes are our largest resource, folks have the question, so where do my property tax dollars go? We took a specific property tax statement for the current tax year, and this particular property has a maximum assessed value of just over $151,000. So when we look at this property, the first 30 cents went to education. 39 cents went to the city of North Bend. This includes our local option levy that was passed for the pool. 7 cents goes to the North Bend Urban Renewal District. Then we have 17 cents that goes to all other general government. So this could include your airport district, or the county. And then the last 7 cents, that goes to bonds. So currently there's the Coos County bond and the North Bend School District bond. Okay, so then we have our 39 cents that comes to the city. How does that further get divvied up? This data is based on fiscal year 21 expenditures. This is how that 39 cents would be spent. So 33 cents would go to police and fire, with a penny each to administration, finance, public works, and parks, totaling 4 cents. And then the last 2 cents goes to unallocated. So unallocated is things like paying for senior center, paying for city hall maintenance, your city attorney fees, IT, those kinds of things. And so how do we decide which services get funded by discretionary funds? A lot of times what plays a role is those services that are not self-supporting. So examples are finance, administration, police and fire, and parks. Those particular services, they don't charge a fee for their service. And so in order to continue those services, we have to use discretionary money to keep them going. Now I said I was going to talk about challenges. And while discretionary funding happens to be the most flexible resource to allocate, the city does recognize some challenges mentioned with property tax revenues. They're not currently keeping up with cost of services. And a lot of that has to do with the impacts of Measure 5 and 50. So first, Measure 5, as Nicole mentioned, is divided taxes into 2 categories. So your education taxes are limited to $5 per thousand of real market value. General government is limited to $10 per thousand of real market value. If either of those categories gets exceeded on the property, the taxes start to be reduced, and we call that compression. And it's important to note, and we'll talk about it a little more later, is that local option taxes get compressed first. So we also have some things we want to hand out today. We're going to have a couple of trivia questions. The first one being, what percentage did Measure 50 limit the maximum assessed value to annually? Yes, correct. All right, so Measure 50 passed in 1997, limited future growth on maximum assessed value to 3% every year. As well, it rolled back the 1997 assessed value on each property to 90% of its 1995 value. And then it also is important to point out that for any existing districts at that time that had an existing tax base, it established a permanent tax rate. So here's what this looks like. You can see that this particular property had a real market value of $150,000 in 1995. Measure 50 was passed in 97, and this value got rolled back to $135,000. And then you can see how annually from there on, it only increased a maximum of 3% each year. So while measures 5 and 50 provide benefits to the taxpayer, they do create challenges for the city. So we rely heavily on these property taxes to fund necessary services like police and fire, but then things like compression and the annual limit on maximum assessed value make it hard for us to keep the budget in balance. So now we'll move on to the non-general fund resources and look at a few challenges there. As mentioned, these are the types of non-general funds. We have special revenue, which could include your library, gas tax, and pool. You have enterprise funds like wastewater and stormwater, capital improvement funds, reserve funds, and debt service funds. And then we learned that these are each comprised of mostly dedicated resources, which we'll talk a little bit more about. First up would be the library fund. So in the library, the dedicated resource here is property tax. Now, I just said that property tax is discretionary. The difference here is that this is not City of North Bend property tax. This is property taxes collected by the library district. The district collects the tax and then distributes those to the libraries within the district. And the money is then used only on operations and maintenance of the library. What's also important to note here is that the city has an agreement with the library district. And that agreement says that the city will be responsible for maintaining the building. So here comes our first challenge. The building is in major need of repairs, approximately $1.5 million. In our gas tax fund, the dedicated resource here is ongoing state gas taxes, and then also surface transportation program funds that trickle down from the state as well. All of these are dedicated to preserving, maintaining, and improving the city streets. The challenge here is that there's a backlog of projects that exceed our savings, and those annual revenues don't increase fast enough to reduce the backlog. So for reference, in fiscal year 21, the city received about $700,000 in gas tax fund. However, we sent about $500,000 out the door for operations and maintenance. And then looking at those surface transportation program funds, those are designated for capital projects. However, in 2020, staff did an analysis, and there's approximately $60 million in roadway replacement costs. In the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, this we consider to be a dedicated resource, and the city will receive approximately $2 million in COVID-19 funding relief as part of the American Rescue Plan. What makes this dedicated money is that it came with restrictions from the Treasury's final rule. However, in those rules, there's a $10 million standard deduction, which means that we can use our whole $2.2 million on general city services, making it a little bit more discretionary. The challenge here is that it's one-time revenue. So we have to consider that generally you only use one-time revenue on one-time projects. So you wouldn't typically use one-time money to fund an ongoing position. And then we get into our stormwater and wastewater funds. These are our enterprise funds, operated like a business. And so the idea here is that you charge an amount that will cover the cost of providing the service. The fees for service revenues are not keeping pace with the increased cost to provide that service. And further, the city is limited annually to increasing fees to the Social Security Administration's annual cost of living adjustment. And so you can see here, this is an illustration using 2017 to 2021 data. So in the wastewater fund, our revenues increased 0.5% in that time frame, and that's annual. However, expenditures each year increased about 2%. Then when you move into the stormwater fund, same time period, revenues increased at about a rate of 1% each year, whereas expenditures were closer to 3%. For the municipal pool, we'll talk about this in two phases, the first one being fiscal year 21, and we'll start with some history. So in March of 2020, we know that the pool closed down due to COVID-19. In May of 2020, public safety fee revenue was cut from the fiscal year 21 police department budget. Does anybody know how much that reduction was? Correct, D. $865,000.
I did not give her that.
So what happens when you read?
And then from July to November, a number of things happened. Police staff was cut, and $375,000 was transferred from the pool budget to the police department budget in order to make ends meet. In spring of '21, staff started researching alternative funding options for the pool, and in May, a local option levy was presented to voters. So what's the dedicated resource here? Well, in fiscal year '21, there wasn't one. This was budgeted out of general fund, which is discretionary money, and that was transferred to the police department. The challenge is the pool would continue to go unfunded in fiscal year '22 if we didn't come up with a dedicated resource. And that's when voters approved that local option levy. So we fast forward to fiscal year '22. The pool now has a dedicated resource. It's a 5-year local option levy, plus some user fees. And these revenues go to cover the cost of operations and maintenance of the pool, plus consider some capital savings for the future. So another trivia question, true or false, the city of North Bend is not affected by compression. Did I hear false? False. We are affected by compression in the pool fund. So if you'll remember when I talked about property taxes, local option levies are the first to get compressed. So there were some compression implications in fiscal year '22. Probably the bigger challenge here, though, is considering what will happen at the end of that 5-year levy. So moving on from non-general funds, let's take a look at other challenges that affect all of our funds. And so when the city considers putting together personnel budgets, we have to look at a number of things. As Nicole pointed out, retirement and insurance, those happen every year and affect all of our employees. As well, we have 3 bargaining units that come with 3 different contracts that we have to adhere to. So the challenge here, again, is revenues are not keeping up with the pace of these high costs. Does anybody know how much did retirement cost increase from 2017 to 2021? D, 500. 500,000, $500,000. So here's some actuals on those personnel cost increases from 2017 to 2021. And here's what it looks like in graphical form. So your first grouping here is your retirement cost, and you can see a steady increase every year from 2017 to 2021, so from the blue to the green. Then you move over to insurance, and again, you can see a steady increase from 2017 to 2021. When we get to wages, it's a little bit different. 2021 drops down. But what you don't see here is the full-time equivalent count. So in 2017, the blue bar, the full-time equivalents were around 70. We're here in 2021, and it's about the same. However, wages went up $400,000. Other challenges that affect multiple funds, and we've kind of already talked about, would be capital needs. So we have a number of capital needs like street improvements, facility improvements, our fleet replacement, park improvements, et cetera, and so on. The challenge here is that the cost of these needs outweighs the savings. So you can see these are some of our reserve funds. And on top of it, these reserve funds, some of them are restricted to just that particular department. So for instance, you can't use the street reserve to fix the tourist building. And I would also just like to point out too, we talked about the streets. There's $60 million in improvements needed there. The library is $1.5 million, and you can see that these figures don't begin to cover those numbers. So let's take a quick recap and look at maybe some solutions to these problems. Property tax. So it covers about 60% of our general fund services. In addition to that, there's a limit on the maximum assessed value to a 3% growth each year. The solution here, we need growth, we need development, we need new buildings, we need vacant land to be developed. And what that does is it'll increase our tax base. Increasing the tax base then increases your property tax revenue. Number 2, this affected multiple funds. We talked about it a few times. Expenditures outpacing revenues. So personnel costs is a big contributor, as we discussed. The other thing is that fees for services, they're not recouping the cost of the service. So a solution there would be to consider maybe new revenue streams, or to consider right-sizing those existing fees for service to match the cost to provide the service. Another challenge that we discussed is there's not enough savings to complete all of our capital improvement projects. And a solution here is that we would continue to apply for grants as we've been doing this last year, as well as we could start to consider some financing options. And then in addition to this, council goal is to develop a capital improvement plan, which would at the very least prioritize these projects. And then we have the issue of the one-time versus ongoing. So you can't support an ongoing position with one-time revenue. So we have to take that into consideration. Sometimes it can make balancing the budget challenging. In the case of the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, the solution here was that council adopted a spending plan, and the spending plan consists mostly of one-time purchases or things that won't need ongoing support or very little. In the pool situation, we talked about compression. All we can really do there is monitor. We did plan for it when we calculated for our local option levy what we were going to ask voters for. But the bigger question here is the 5-year timeline. So what happens at the end of 5 years? And some options could be to ask voters to renew that levy. We could look to see if there's discretionary funding available in the general fund, or it could be a combination of those two. Another idea would be to see if another agency may want to take over operations of the pool. And then at number 6, we just have to remember dedicated resources cannot be used as discretionary resources. So our library fund, those resources are intended for operating the library. You couldn't buy police cars, sorry, chief. The wastewater fund, same thing. Those revenues are intended for operating the wastewater, and so you couldn't put a new roof on the library. And looking to the future, Finance Department has many goals to improve our budget development process and start tackling some of these challenges. I personally would like to improve our forecasting methods and models, and what this would do is to help us prepare for future budget impacts looking further down the road. I would also like to look to improve transparency of the budget to the public. One of the ways that I plan to do this next year is through a digital budget book. It'll make it easier for the public to navigate the budget document and provide some more detail to the reader. And for anybody who's interested, you can find our budgets online. And these finance goals also align with council goals, and a lot of the solutions proposed here align with council goals, and that is to seek aligning current revenues with needs, look for new funding sources, and then we're also continuing to seek public input on prioritizing service levels. You'll see a community survey coming out in the near future. And that wraps up my presentation.